shared experience and regional specificities. It's linked to the work that has been done. I should have started before and then the power would have come earlier. So I was just welcoming you all to this workshop, Developments in Conservation Theory, which is part of this meeting of the Romanian EU presidency. Many thanks to our Romanian host for organizing this conference, for putting the quality at the core of our discussions, and for linking it to regional specificities in this particular case. Thank you so much. I have personally attended a lot of heritage meetings, but very often the setting is not as beautiful as this is. Thank you very much, yes. It's worth an applause. I hope it will also inspire our discussions. Let's start immediately with the presentations, and let me remind you that we actually have a task. We have a rapporteur, Andrea, sitting there, and her task will be to collect our recommendations at different levels with regard to this particular theme on developments in conservation theory. But before we do that, let's listen to our different speakers. I will immediately bring the apologies from Benjamin Mouton from E-Commerce France, because he could really not make it here, and he regrets it very, very much. My understanding is that he considers Romania as his second homeland. But he sent his presentation, which has a lot of visual material, and you also received a translation of the text in your papers. Thank you to the Romanian organizers for providing that. So we will have his visual presentation at least. So may I now invite Professor Kovacs to give the first presentation. He will address this specific topic. And please, if you have questions about his presentation, my hope is that we can have maybe one question immediately after each presentation, but I would like to have a general discussion at the very end. So keep that in mind as well, please.
Thank you very much for your introduction, and thank you for being here. As it happens, we are all concerned about cultural, or rather architectural heritage. I wish I could say a few things about the most recent developments in the specific theory, but unfortunately I only saw for a short while the very recent book of Benjamin Mouton, Sens et Renaissance du patrimoine architectural. That was during my recent visit in Paris, but didn't have the chance to own it so far. But it's better, thanks. So I can't make a reference to it, but I'm sure that the presentation he sent us will replace this fault of mine. Rather, I should like to address a topic which is not so much locally specific, but I think it's very particularly close to our interests and concerns today. My title, as usual, is overstated. It's called Hybrid Theories. In fact, I have one single point to make, which I will do right from the beginning, with the hope that with a few images and examples I shall discuss afterwards, I can somehow support it. My point is as follows. Would you? Next, and next. Can't you? Yeah, that's right. These two fields are both subject to widespread and, well, almost unanimously accepted, at least in Europe, texts of specific legislation. They both are subject to scientific gatherings and have already the benefit of large amounts of specific theories. In what concerns cultural landscape, which is a bit more recent, but not much more recent in our preoccupations here, at least in this part of the world, Romania is also already part of the 2000 Paris Convention, Florence Convention, sorry. The European Landscape Convention, which I shall discuss in just a few aspects later on. What is seldom happening is to couple the two together, the two fields. The argument goes as follows. Built heritage is obviously one of the most precious parts of cultural landscape. Built heritage is very material. Cultural landscape is a conglomerate, is a creation, is a construct rather, a way of seeing the world around us, of which built heritage is a part, is an important, very important part. Still, and however, the two fields benefit of two different approaches, sometimes intersecting, but more or less accidentally. What I wish to suggest to all of us, that we treat the two aspects of our culture together in hybrid theories, which would encompass both built heritage and unbuilt or, well, perceived or, well, again, intangible. Landscape is intangible, in spite of what the other camp say. The horizon is always elsewhere. But nonetheless, we do landscape management, landscape reconstruction, and so on and so forth. This is something one really can discuss at length. I cannot do that. What I'm trying to do instead is to argue for the hybridation of the two theoretical fields in order to achieve better practical results. Could I have the next slide, please? It's not it. Yes, thank you. Now, this is not Transylvania. This is Umbria in Italy, where the cultural landscape is quite familiar, I should say, even for those of us who don't go there often. And it's composed of built and natural elements. The natural elements are ambiguous because the large green pastures in the mid-distance are actually man-made. The woods, the forests have been taken away in order to leave surfaces for the animals to graze. So it's really what is quite well defined as a human and natural compound, which is cultural landscape. Umbria is the place where very often earthquakes occur. This is a natural aspect which we tend to overlook either when we do monument preservation or when we do landscape studies and interventions. So this is the foreseeable, unforeseen hazard, which should be taken into account and which is obviously part of the Umbrian cultural landscape, whether we like it or not. We rather don't, but still it's there. Next, please. Now, this is a fragment, and next. It is a fragment of the European Landscape Convention, which here, in these, next please, and next, and next, and next, and next, and next. It's a long list, well, a middle-sized list of earlier conventions, on which the European Landscape Convention is grounded. which also concerns biodiversity, natural milieus, natural reservations, and so on and so forth. Within all this, within this particular cultural landscape where earthquakes occur, there are historical monuments which collapse eventually, like is the case of the Santa Maria della Neve in Cascia, made apparently by someone from the school of Bramante, and which fell after having been consolidated with reinforced concrete elements in order to make it more solid. It didn't make it more solid, so it collapsed and was conserved in its ruinous state, again with reinforced concrete. Next, please. This is what it looked before the disaster, and next. And this is one of the frescoes which ornated the niches inside this octagonal small church. Next. Now, the conservation put these glass boxes in front of the niches after the roof and the ceiling collapsed in order to protect the frescoes, but instead of protecting them, they changed the microclimate, so there was mold developing and the frescoes are falling off. Now, nobody would dare presuppose that Italian conservationists were had ill fate or didn't know their job. It simply didn't work the way they thought it would. And now, next. The matter is getting worse. Moreover, there was another earthquake in 2016 which made further stone facing collapse in spite of the reinforced concrete conservation intervention following the earlier 79 earthquake. So what we do as conservationists is failing perhaps to take into account all the data of a given cultural landscape. In the case of Umbria, it's earthquakes. Next, please. The freshly fallen stones of the pilasters inside and the glass boxes. Next. And this is a heap of the stones of the vaulting which fell during the first earthquake, piled together, carefully collected in order to be someday perhaps reconstructed. So my story goes a bit towards reconstruction, which is obviously the most controversial possible intervention in monument conservation. Next. Nature started to take over, as you could see. And now I'm shortly coming back to the text of the, please let me see all the texts of this page, all the lines of the page, please. That's right, thank you. What I underlined is landscape protection, natural configuration, and human activity, or human activity. I think it's not and or, it's and, at least in Europe. We don't really have non-human cultural landscape anymore. Landscape management, harmonized changes, so there are changes, of course there are, but harmonizing them takes a great deal of study and a multiple layered study, including what earthquake miseries can bring about. Landscape planning, restore, create landscapes, that's problematic because the essence of landscape is of being intangible, so we intervene in the landscape as the same way we intervene on a historical monument without touching its meaning. We can only intervene on the material part. In the landscape, it's about the same. We do change plants or cultures, but the landscape is something we perceive from innumerable points of view by innumerable spectators. If there's no one to look at, there is no landscape, of course. So when we move to landscape theory without too much caution ideas and notions from monument heritage, from heritage preservation theory, we might mistake a construct, a mental image, with a construction, and that's reifying landscape and taking away its potential as a unifying milieu for our secular societies. If we concentrate on the object of the historical monument, we tend to change it into, well, just an object, and tend to forget what it is precious for, and it's the meaning which is, again, intangible. Next, please. Still, I think I'm running out of time, am I? Yeah. Well, so I just do go quickly ahead, please. These are the fallen churches of Norcia, still in Umbria, following the 2016 earthquake. We should come to the city walls of Norcia, because last May there was a workshop around discussing whether they should be reconstructed or not. We saw. Please, I should like to have all the slides until we come to the city walls of Norcia. This is just a series of fallen churches. They were all reinforced with concrete before the earthquake, and fell victims to the same sort of disaster. Could you go on with my slides, please? I can't. There is no remote control. Oh, it doesn't work. Oh well, then I'll just tell the story and stop here if it doesn't work. Ah, it does work. They had to build temporary shelter for the inhabitants of the town. Here, let's stop here a bit. And these are the city walls of Norcia, which kept the same trace since the Roman times. So these are city walls which never changed their place, unlike in so many other cases of fortified towns. And the question was whether should we reconstruct them, would it be authentic or not? And this is the one and only case where I am almost convinced that yes, they should be reconstructed, and yes, it will be authentic, because 3 years ago, everyone saw them as they were at that point, entire and perfectly all right. They are very well measured, they are very well documented, and they had lived all along as defense structures. What is their use today? They still defend the old town from the new town around it, which would otherwise invade the historic city center of Norcia. So this is probably one case where reconstruction is not only possible, but is also desirable and professionally correct. Unlike in the case of the already notorious case of Capidava on the Danube shore of Romania, where the reconstruction is completely fictitious. And finally, what it did was to hide almost completely the historical monument which was underneath. But the cultural landscape of the Danube was doing very well with the ruins of Capidava, unearthed by archaeologists only relatively recently. Whereas the Umbrian cultural landscape would do so much better with the reconstructed city walls of Norcia. And I stop here, thank you. Sorry.
Thank you. Well, that was right in the middle of what we are supposed to talk about. Are there any questions in the room? To Professor Kavax? No, not yet. Well, then I will raise a first question. In the guidelines that we received from the organizers, one of the questions was, how do a theory on conservation impact the reality on the ground? And when just seeing the last two examples, that was right in the middle, and I see that Stefan is laughing. So, who decided on reconstructing the city walls? And was that decision, let's say, impacted by research and thinking and around it? And who decided to reconstruct the walls at the Danube? Was that also inspired by research and by conservation theory?
Perfect question, Vedik. Now, for the first part, Norcia, the workshop did not end with a decision. I expect it would end with a conclusion at some point and followed by the decision makers, taking position. My position there, which I expressed earlier, was to reconstruct, and that was completely against any theory I know about and any previous practice. So I suppose the walls of Norcia are the exception, notable, remarkable exception to the overall, the first answer to the question, should we reconstruct or not, is no, with probably very few exceptions where this is perfectly arguable. Mm-hmm. The second case, I would transfer the question to my friend and colleague Adi Crăciunescu, who knows everything about the Capidava case, about who took the decision and what theoretical background was behind it.
No, there was no theoretical. It was the opportunity of using some money from European funding. So the
Rapporteur, please note that.
So
we will find the proper wording for it, but it is.
I will try to be brief. I was part of National Commission of Historic Monuments, and I was sent on the field to make a report together with some colleagues about what happened there. And it happened that an intention of completing to adding wall height up to 6 meters height on top of the original ruins of several antiquity, medieval periods. So it was an opportunity for developing tourism. So that was the theoretical argument. And they conceived how do you call it, a tender. It was submitted to the market, and some people joined, and eventually one team won the project, but probably they were not very convinced about the necessity, but that was the demand, so they fulfill it. That's the simple, and it's full of paradoxes of history, what happens when you build something that mixes several stages of history which don't mix together because they were in fact in different times. So it's completely, also the details, it's a very, very long discussion for that. But to be very brief, it's one of the, I don't know, consequences of existence of funding for projects that are not controlled in their quality as design, but they are only in accounting and the way the money are spent, how many tourists on paper you may count afterwards. Imagine that this site is on the shores of Danube in a village, and they designed a complex lighting system for nobody, because who will spend the night there to see Capidava by night? It's not in the middle of the city, or it's not. It's even on the false premises built as. So I could speak much more, but I will rather stop.
Yes, there's another question.
Klaus-Peter Echter, also from ICOMOS, but it's the same question. Is what did the Heritage Authority tell to this problem? Did they?
Sorry. On the second question, Can you answer what the answer of the Heritage Authority was, or is it like in many cases that we have seen that the heritage authorities just have to go with the decisions that were already made because of the availability of the money? Or Stefan, maybe you can.
I think I can probably make some assumptions. What we know is that the project was approved by the heritage authorities as we see it. So it's not an illegal project. And that, sorry? Yes, and unfortunately this reflects also the dysfunctionality of the heritage authorities when it comes to judging quality, and this is their main aim, to judge quality of interventions. And there are several reasons for this situation. Some of them are objective reasons. For instance, the committees that do assess projects are overburdened, overloaded with too much work to do in too short a time, with no previous preparation by the ministry which is overseeing the entire activity of assessing these projects. So this could be an objective reason, it is, and it's easy to address it if there is a decision at the top level. Just add people or also work on the process and make it a process that benefits from the latest technology, and not just use stacks of paper and move them from one place to another, and then you can improve the let's say the workflow of the assessors. So there are practical solutions for a practical question, but this is let's say the easy part of the answer. To me, the hard part of the answer is that also there are people in the bodies that assess projects that consider that this is correct. And that is much harder to address, because it's about education, it's about keeping up with the international debate on cultural heritage, on theory and on practice, and we are behind with all this. So in this case, to me, that is a more worrying part. And in the end, all can be considered a success story if tourists will appear. And no one in the public debate will address the issue of quality, because we have other... Yes, and Adrian tells me to mention that also the planners, the architects who planned this intervention are accredited by the Ministry of Culture to perform such specialized design on cultural heritage. So that's why I'm saying it's a legal project. It has fulfilled it has gone through all the steps of the institutional system for the assessment of projects, and in the end it's a failure. But indeed, Adrian pointed out rightly that there are some reasons for the whole story from the very beginning of the project, because it didn't start from the needs of the monument, but from false needs of increasing tourism. So someone just saw the opportunity to benefit from funding in order to create some fictitious indicators to tick, and then what we end up with is a destroyed heritage site that was in the beginning very relevant, authentic, rich in teachings and evidence, and now it's a fake monument.
I don't know who put it this way, but I like very much this. It was restored beyond the possibility of any repair. That was...
Does everybody agree that the rapporteur notes this expression? You also had a very good expression. It was legal but not?
Legal but illegitimate, yes.
I think it's time to move to the next presentation. Terje, you will take this from another angle.
Definitely. Definitely, I have a completely different angle. I have a presentation. I can hardly see it myself. Yeah, I will. I have a manuscript. No, first of all, I wanted to say that my reading of this, can you go to the next slide? Yes. Conservation theory. For me, conservation is a subject in itself, which is taught at high schools and universities, also technical schools. Oh, sorry. Technical schools and universities. And we, I come from a government body, we use conservators. But we seldom talk about conserving buildings. We talk about restoring buildings or maintaining buildings. And I think it's interesting that we just remember slowly how these things have developed from the 1950s. In the 50s and onwards, we were still doing individual objects, you know, and then it moved slowly to ensembles, and now we do the whole environment and the security zone around. We even engage in urban cultural landscapes. That means protecting maybe 30, 40 houses in one go. Now, it is in this context that conservation per se is carried out, but mostly in museums and churches, etc. So for me, conservation theory is actually the shift in our attitude that has happened during the last 30, 40 years. But I would like to start off on another note. Can you go to the next slide, please? Yeah, there's a lot of, yeah, exactly, okay. You see, when we talk about quality, it is surprising how little agreement there is about what quality is. It's actually quite an interesting small exercise to do. So I go for this, but I will go through a couple of other ones too. The totality of features and characteristics of a product or a service that bears its ability to satisfy stated or implied needs. This is an ISO 9000 or ISO 8402 definition. Fit for purpose is another term used for quality. You make it fit for purpose. Now, but some people say that this is inapplicable to art and culture. I'm not sure. So quality is often measured in terms of conformance to requirements. We will come back to what kind of requirements we have in the cultural heritage sector. And quality is compliance to the best known standards, procedures, and specifications. So, that's my sign that you can change the slide. You have to follow. There's a lot of pushing that. Come on, change the slide. Okay. So then finally, we have to arrive at a definition of quality that we can work with and that we can live with. And if they can manage to change the slide, there is another definition that says that the degree of excellence of something is quality. It's an improvement in product quality. So that puts it in a relationship to something we didn't do well enough before. We are improving on something. And then the final one is in manufacturing. And we have become a means of production. And we are slowly becoming more of a means of production as this commission policy goes on. But we are going along with it for other reasons. Okay. So it's free from defects, deficiencies, and significant variations. It is brought about through a strict, consistent commitment to certain standards, achieving uniformity of a product in order to satisfy specific customer and user measurements. Yes, okay, that's fine. That was the slide I was going to ask for now. So my definition would rather be this: the totality of features and characteristics of a product or service that bears its ability to satisfy stated or implied needs. Now, what does this really mean? It means somebody is playing the ball back to us. They're saying, if you want quality, my God, you have to have stated needs or implied needs, and you have to detail them. You have to specify them. And only then will we get quality in the real sense of the word. Okay? Can you just go to the next slide? If it's working? Yes? Okay. The only point with this slide is that a guideline, since we are talking about quality guidelines, what is the definition of a guideline? It's a general rule, it's a principle, or it is a piece of advice. In this case, the quality specifications are a piece of advice. But through a genial stroke of organizational manipulation, the European Commission has managed to sidestep the treaty, which I think is a good thing, because now you have to apply these guidelines. They are a condition if you want money. If you don't want the money, who cares? But if you want money from us, we are telling you you have to do it like this and that, etc. So, and then finally to the more practical part. I haven't followed the watch. Are you keeping the time? Yeah. Good. Okay. Can we have the next slide? Just go through the whole thing. Okay. And then there's not so much pressing. Well, there are a number of European standards specifically developed for material cultural heritage. And one that we are using a lot in Norway, and which we are also applying or trying to apply to the EEA Norway grants project, is the condition survey of building or constructions. This standard is mentioned as a must in the quality guidelines from the EU, and we have been using it for years. And then what we were looking for was a method that was transparent, replicable, comparable, and we have national objectives for the quality of our built, protected, and historic heritage. So we need to measure, how are we doing? And if you want funding from us, you have to do the condition survey first, attach it to the application, and there is mandatory condition survey at the end of the project. So can we have the next picture? Yes. Of course, you don't understand the text. It's not important. This was just to show you. This is from 2013. These are the percentage of buildings in a bad maintenance condition. These 41% only require minor repairs or maintenance. And 41% is a good standard. Only ordinary maintenance is required. And ideally, we should have all the buildings in this group. But of course, the ideal condition never happens in reality. But this also guides us to where should we prioritize our money, our funding. In these, maybe. And it allows us to monitor the development. Can I have the next slide, please? Yes, just a couple of things. I've said part of this before, but I think there are two things I would like to mention. The professional capacity in the heritage organizations is slowly becoming a real handicap. First of all, we don't have enough people to do what we are supposed to do. And then in addition, we are supposed to ensure quality in transversal projects, in sector cross-cutting projects. Work with the tourist industry, with the transport industry, with the construction industry, etc. And we have to check, quality checks, whatever, funding, project management. Do we have enough people? No. And do we have the right people? No. And then just the SEN standards. I wasn't going to take it very far, so can I just have the next project? This is just, you will probably get the presentation, but this is a list of the present standards that have come through the SEN, and they're all listed in the proposal for the quality guidelines. So a project now, as I see it, should indicate clearly where it will use the standards, why they are applicable, and then do it. You cannot get away with an application anymore for interventions on cultural heritage without at least mentioning a couple of the standards. There are the main general terms and definitions. There is a standard underway for the conservation process, and there's the maintenance, the condition and recording for cultural heritage, and the condition survey. So there's one condition survey for the built heritage, and there's one condition survey for collections, for more museum stuff, so because it's a different procedure. So these will become mandatory. In a way, it's like putting money in the bank. The more standards you can use, the better off you are in your application. So watch out for this. And I think I have one final one. No, I don't. So I'll end up there. So my advice is to use the standards, to make them mandatory when they are applicable. And to do that, we need to solve a small financial problem, because the standards cost money. That's not my intervention or invention. But we need, and we are working with the Commission to see if we can finance the standards for the cultural heritage sector without forcing you to pay. So that's a...
Thank you. That was indeed one of the recommendations of the document produced by ICOMOS on the quality principles. Are there any questions right now for Thierry? Not yet. I will ask one thing. Thierry, isn't this a, let's say, something that we see very regular, that people think they do it so much better than before? And, and so I see that a lot of energy and time and money is spent on undoing conservation or restorations from the past. We have seen the disaster of the concrete intervention, that's just one. In the presentation by Benjamin Mouton, there are a few others, but I think also of the attitude of some architects of today who think, oh, what was done in the past was bad anyway. Is that the right attitude to start to do the work?
Well, I hope these architects you mentioned never get into contact with cultural heritage. But since we are expanding, you know, the number of protected objects, the number of historical protection-worthy objects is increasing generally. And since we are doing increasing amounts of transformations and reuse modulations, then we need the architects, because they have a job to do. So, yes and no, I wouldn't focus so much on that. I think your first question was more interesting. What is this arrogance that we think we are doing so much better now than before? Well, there are a couple of reasons for it. First of all, before, if you go back in time, there was no conservation. You know, and
Then you go.
well, I'm only going about 150 years back. Yeah, it's not that okay. And then I must say this concrete stuff and the general architectural ideology in the 50s and 60s was very bad for cultural heritage. And the fact that you didn't realize that you were mixing two materials that don't move together. On the contrary, they kill each other. Mm-hmm. But on a final note, I would say Norway, we don't have much of this problem, because most of our architecture is wood. And you cannot fuck up wood so easily. Well, but we don't do that. We put in other wood. And it's a very different approach from having a large stone monument or shoring up a church that's crumbling with concrete. It works for a short period, and we have an expression in Norwegian which is called, it goes for the winter though. Don't try to keep warm by pissing in your pants. And that's what we have been doing.
I'm not sure that I will ask our rapporteur to put that in our report. Unless you mention Darius' name. Yes, the topic of our conference is also about regional specificities. And isn't that a little bit in contradiction with standards?
No, a standard is a general thing. You know, I can speak more than one language. Yes. Does that make me better or worse or something, you know? Now, a standard must be flexible enough to be applicable in different situations. Otherwise, it's not a good standard. We are not talking about uniforming things. We are talking about standardizing them, which is mostly a particular procedure that is set forward that you have to follow to see that you're doing all the right steps and you've carried them out and brings you to a conclusion, hopefully, okay? So I don't see any conflict between the use of standards and regional specificities. You know, if you are doing a condition survey of an old brick church or an old stone church or a wooden church, you are proceeding in the same way, but you are handling different material compositions. That's where the difference lies.
Yep. I think that it's a very important thing to underline what the standard is. It's describing the processes and the procedures so that you can compare, so that you can share experience, so that you can monitor. But it's not a recipe for a result.
No.
Huh?
No. No, it's not a recipe for a certain result. The result is open. But it's a recipe for a certain methodology. And it's the methodology that will give you quality if you follow up on your findings.
Thank you. I wanted to have that stressed. Klaus-Peter, please.
Just a small question. You spoke about the standards, and I think you said it should be transparent, replicant, and what was the third one?
Transparent, replicable, and let me go back. Replicable and comparable. Mm.
For monuments, and it's not increasing because, of course, now we have monuments of the 1960s. You spoke about the concrete. Brutalism is really now a topic in the monument, in the heritage discussion. But we lose, of course, monuments, and so it's not. I don't think it's, at least what I understand, or in my country, it's not that there's an increase in heritage objects.
There is. There is. According to your German colleagues, there is an increase. And in Belgium, it has increased about 10 times since the 70s. In my country, it has tripled. But this is not the only reason why I'm saying we are increasing. We are increasing the number of constructions we are putting under construction, no, under protection, sorry. That is what you call a monument. We hardly use this term anymore. But then we have about 500,000 of historic buildings, which are also listed. They were not listed 20 years ago, but they're not protected. But they are listed in the property register, so any application for change to this house that comes to the municipal authorities will be handled cautiously. And we are also seeing the need to protect modern architecture slowly. So we are, in a sense, and if we want to be cross-sectorial and we want to be relevant for the other sectors, we have to handle a larger amount of buildings and structures than those who are officially protected. We are handling historic environments. How would Sigishwara look if only individual objects were protected and there was no general management plan? It would be a disaster. So that shows, it's just to illustrate the shift that we are facing now.
Other questions from the room at this stage? No, you're keeping all the questions for the end. Why not? I will follow the order of the program. Francesc, now it's your turn. Now, you made us a very good presentation this morning already with the general principles. Do you, how do you react on everything that you have heard up till now?
Well, I will bring one aspect we discussed very briefly at the end of my presentation, asking how these kind of recommendations who are based, how these recommendations who are based on some more important involvement of civil society, not working. No, there's no presentation. No, it's there's no presentation. So. I can talk about Venice, I think. I recognize the photo, but nevertheless. So I think that it's another dimension, because Terje already saying that you have a burden in the sense of dealing with a lot of effects and things to matter about. So then I'm not a specialist on conservation, but I would like to know and launch the idea of when we are trying to involve more the society, and I think the few things I read on conservation theory is very much on this movement, the changing from this very objective context to a more subjective context, who is already problematic. But even if we put this cross-sectional approach, we have intersubjective approach, who is really an issue. So the question is how we can try at the same time keep the quality of the work done, and at the same time including the potential participation of the civil society in defining the things. Because there was different things. You also insisted that satisfy the stated needs. Of course, if we're talking about that, in some sense, society is also the needs. And I think that the theory on conservation has moved from that, from being a very needs who are related to a technical or aesthetical competence, to something who is far larger. And we find it in all the documents of the Council of Europe and other places where we are moving to this concept of integrated, who incorporates also the specific usage by the civil society. And so then maybe the point is to try to see what are the possibilities, the good points and the bad points that can have this participation, increase the participation with civil society. I think that maybe one thing that the civil society can be a good point is that it can be some kind of monitoring thing. Because if we have so much artifacts to control, it's clear, as you say, we don't have enough people to know that. So clearly here the civil society can be a way to monitor these kind of things and to make information on the fact that there is a deterioration and so on, and some requirement is done. Of course, they cannot do it on their own. And then the point is to find how we can structure in a way that there is a better cooperation, let's say, with more authority level, because most of the conservators are members of the ministries and so on, and some, let's say, more NGOs or initiatives who are not related to the government. And so here I think it's a challenge that has to be considered, and maybe sometimes there is temptations to use the possibilities, limited possibilities of the civil society to make some conservation. But for example, we have situations in Spain that was terrible because they didn't have the money, they didn't have the contacts with the conservators, so they asked to someone to do something, and it was terrible. So here, yes, I remember, the Eche Homo, yes. So then we arrive at this voluntarism who is excessive. So the idea is that I think that we have to, in order to keep the quality, we have to have a way to better collaborate between these different initiatives who can be this kind of custodians of the thing and alert on some problems, and also the authorities who are more in charge of the renovation and the conservation and so on, in order to collaborate together and to be more effective, not to have a situation where the things are so destroyed that afterwards, as we say, the repair is excessive and we arrive at situations that they consider that putting some inappropriate material has to go there. And related to the case of Umbria, I think that within the Faro Convention really tries to push this involvement, but of course it's not going really in these very technical aspects, because we consider that the people have not this competence, but they can provide something. But I think that presenting the case of Umbria, where there was this earthquake, I remember of one of the cases we have in our network, the Faro Convention network, was the case of Fontecchio. And Stefan knows well, because we know the very active mayor of Fontecchio. Fontecchio is near L'Aquila, and they suffer from the earthquake 10 years ago. Of course, it's already a very little village, 500 inhabitants. Not easy to reach, because it's in the mountains. So the strike of the earthquake was really putting at risk completely the existence of the village. And historically, it's very important, because they have a very medieval context and they have to protect it. But then the work they did it in terms of reconstruction was done not only with the technicians, but also with the population, in order to, at the same time they reconstruct the historical remains, they reconstruct also the structure, the socio-economic structure of the village. And there was an occasion to mobilize all the citizens in order to participate to this regeneration through cultural heritage, and also to go beyond, to have a system where we provide the means for people to stay in the place and still doing some job external. So they are pushing for having high-band internet and things like that, who are not really something related to cultural heritage, but that can the idea is that this kind of bringing tools that allow the people to live there can be a way that these people who has been engaged in this regeneration will still there and will continue to be these custodians. So I think that it is also the important point is to have this idea that we have to bring to the people, if we want them to do this job of being custodians and to be and to protect to give them some additional resources that make that they're in some sense linked to this territory, and it's very important. So here I think that it will be interesting to see to what extent, because if you have people who are remaining there, who can have some skills, for example, for reparation or something like that. We have seen it here, for example, in Visky or in other places, that we have trained locals to do some tasks that can help in the cultural heritage maintenance. So here I think that we have to see how this shortage, let's say, of expertise, of money, of all kind of shortages, can be in some sense relaxed through this better interaction between the different partners, not only saying, okay, it's just an expertise aspect, and if we don't have the expert and the money associated, we don't do nothing, and on the other side. And the good example was also I was discussing with someone on the use of old craft and techniques, and I think that is very important. And for many years I work on major hazards, and it's clear that in these cases this kind of thing is very important, because it can be done in some sense by people who can obtain this qualification, and it can be very sustainable, because you don't need a big intervention, or, as you say, the famous money left by this country or by European Union, because it can be self-sustainable through the resources that you obtain in a usual way. So, as I say, I'm not going to sell something, it's only to open a little bit the question and to know, because we are working more on the communities, so it will be interesting for us to arrive and say, okay, we were in the meeting, the quality was this point, and these are the trends that we can collaborate and help in this sense, and how on the other side the experts can help you. So it will be very interesting. having your feedback on that in order to know what is the kind of cooperation that you can imagine that can be mutual win situation. Thank you.
Any questions from the room at this stage? No? Well, then Terje.
Now, this talking about the participative approach. You mentioned that the general public could be a monitoring agency. And in Norway it is. Just two examples. One time they were washing the old municipal house from 1600 and something. And there was immediately 20 calls from 8 o'clock in the morning till 10 o'clock in the morning. There were 20 calls from people saying, what the hell are they doing with high pressure water into the roof here? And it turned out they had got permission. The other example was about the same. There was close to my house, there was somebody suddenly destroying a German machine gun emplacement in the middle of town because they were refurbishing their restaurant. They didn't know it was protected. It was stopped after half an hour because everybody called into this help telephone at the town antiquarian's office. Okay. So, but what we cannot allow the people to do is the technical part. Okay. We can use them to monitor, and we can use them as pressure groups. Yeah, we can use them as pressure groups, saying we want this house on the municipal list of protection-worthy buildings, and then they can pressure the municipality to forward it to the county, so that it can come to us as a document. All those things are fine, but you know we have a saying. I'll drop the thing about incompetent people working in houses, and then houses from the Middle Ages falling down because of some Polish plumber, you know. But we have a saying that when we protect houses, and mind you, I'm not saying monuments. When we protect houses, if we cannot, and most of them are being lived in, they're being used. So we say, if we cannot help these people to get a modern kitchen and a modern bathroom, we have lost.
Yes, I think that the panel wants to react, Mr. Kovacs.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. For several years now, the Romanian Order of Architects finances children books, teaching them architecture and built heritage. It doesn't show the results. It hasn't shown any results yet. How can you get your people to react, to be aware of the value of historical monuments in Norway?
Because they are Norwegians.
Well, how correct? How correct? Well, we expect that in a way from Norwegians, that they are that they're interested in their country, interested in the history, and actually willing to go die for the country too. That's a sign of being a Norwegian. Now, and these are historic town environments I'm talking about. I'm not talking about, you know, the new building, pre-packed, flat-pack, no, because that, you know, the design of very many buildings are not made from aesthetical architectural starting point. It's made from an economic and capital starting point, and that's, I think, is the. And if you people don't have this identity, they don't identify with their surroundings, with their houses, with their local culture, with their group culture, or whatever you call it, then you basically have a problem, because then you have a population which is not at all interested in what we are trying to do.
The other thing that I realized from my experience is that in Norway and more generally in the Nordic countries, a lot of attention is being paid to transparency and accountability. And that's really part of their culture, and that helps enormously. If only we could have the same, yes. I was also linked to that, very much interested in what Francesc said, because in fact, actually you were again advocating the integrated conservation approach, which the Council of Europe introduced as far back as 1975. So we are always coming back to, let's say, fundamental principles that were already integrated. The only thing is that maybe we get a better understanding and that it triggers down into all aspects of our work. How do you see that?
No, the integrated part is still there because it's some kind of basis, of course. But I think that also it brings the new ideas is also to have this difference between the different groups or communities that appear and that have different perceptions. And so, once again, then we have the problem of the needs. So these needs sometimes are very common. And I think that maybe is the strong part, for example, cases of some countries, that they have a very common way of seeing what are the needs. And so then there's no problem. But when you have potential conflicts of the needs, then the problem is huge. Because the interventions, and I think that it puts in risk the interventions, even technical, because you bring some additional conflict about the implications of these technical interventions. And here, I think it's something that has emerged more precisely in the Farragut Convention, where we have this concept of different narratives that has to coexist and will appear more, because we are talking of societies who are being more diverse with different approaches. And we see even in historical places, when we discuss about the cities, that people has a vision who's very economic, and then of course all the historical part is put apart as soon as the economic aspect overcomes the other things. Others who are conscious of the opposite, that we have gone too far and then we have to reincorporate. And others maybe over the other opposite, so they don't want to change anything, just keeping the things that it is. So here, the emergence of some kind of common needs that can be solved by an intervention is put in challenge also by this diversity of the perceptions of the heritage. So I think that is another point that is bring in further than the typical just integrated approach, saying, okay, we have to take care of the people. It's clear. Mm-hmm.
And then to link it again to our task given by the presidency, is there any recommendation that we should link to that, especially not at a general EU level, but more to take into account the local and the regional element?
Well, maybe the point is that of course, the tasks are separated, and as we say, it's obvious, and I think that we totally agree that the technical work has to be developed by the specialists, because it's high-level technicity. The question is that also. If we are talking of high-level technicity, it's clear that we don't have. Afterwards, in terms of very simple maintenance of things like that, then it's also a question to know, because then I don't know, people who are just repainting their home, it's maybe something who will help to protect it. And it's not something who is needed to make a conservator intervene. But it has to be done in certain ways. So here the standards, the definition of guidelines and things like that are important, and to communicate it to the people. And local authorities can be a very good way to intervene in this aspect, because they're defining what can be done. We have that very simply in many countries. For example, I live in Alsace. There are villages, you have the obligation to use a certain number of colors in painting, because that corresponds to the traditional colors of the houses during centuries. But that has to be enforced directly by the municipality. So they can have some kind. The idea is to try to find how we can better help in this task. It's not to replace, it's clear, but how we can better help.
Yeah, sure.
I think we should stop regarding the built heritage or the constructed heritage as one-dimensional. There are differences. In my country, we have something that we call the protected buildings of national interest. Okay, so they have to do with the whole country, with the nation, etc. But at the regional level, there can be different considerations for wanting to protect something. And if you move even further down or along the same level of regional, then you will have the same problem with ethnic. And then you can have the ethnic people also decide much more by their own what kind of objects would we like to preserve as an ethnic group, and there would technically be no conflict.
Thank you. Yes, Stefan?
If you want to proceed with the last presentation, I'll keep the questions for the end, or whatever you prefer. I have several questions. That's
you
why.
have several questions, yes. Then I suggest that we first go to the presentation. I will stand so that I can see it.
For this one, we finally have the
I
remote.
prefer, because I only have two hands, if you can do it. Yeah?
Okay.
Yeah, okay. So this is the presentation that Benjamin Mouton sent us. It has a lot of visual material, and I thought it was nice for you to see them. First, where does this project come from? The Ministry of Culture in France asked ICOMOS France to think about the Venice Charter and quality. And ICOMOS France brought this at the level of the Europe group and invited all European committees to cooperate. Yes, the next one is. The first thing what they did is to think about how the thinking about heritage had evolved, starting from let's say, all the previous international conferences of the architects and technicians on historic monuments, like it was called, with Paris, Athens, Paris, Venice, 1964. That was a meeting in Paris. This was Venice. By the way, there was a very funny picture of Paris, only men in the room. I heard some comments, to be honest, about the first panel this morning as well from my colleagues. There's still some work to do. The next slide, this is a little bit difficult to read, but I will try to, and it's in French, but I will try to summarize it. It's a quote, and actually it was mentioned, there was a reference to what was said by this panel. Just application of some simple rules. It's too, let's say, it would be too simple to think that this application would solve all our problems, whereas we need a little bit more thinking to, and it's the attitude that is guarantee of the success. And in fact, there are two qualities that would be needed. The first one is the respect for the heritage, and the second is to be humble in when we do an intervention. And a heritage is not an opportunity for architects nowadays. To affirm their personality. This is a quote of 1976 by Raymond Lemaire, one of the founding fathers of ICOMOS, and it was quite interesting to see that. And also when we I think it was you, Professor Kovacs, who mentioned something about the attitude of contemporary architects. The next slide, please. What ICOMOS France did was also to look at the two official versions of the Venice Charter, because in fact it was written in French and it was translated later by Lord Euston, I think. And in fact there was no group and there was no discussion on the translation. When you retranslate let's say the English into French, you see immediately the differences. The Belgians were aware of that because we always work in 2 languages, or official journalists like that. But for many people, this was a big discovery. So what we saw is that in the original French version, there was a little bit more focus on let's say, on the spirit, on the intangible. In the English version, often it was more pragmatic, but the differences were sometimes very huge. However, the main technical notions remain the same in the 2 linguistic versions. What can we conclude? Well, actually, first of all, that we need to be aware of those differences, that we need to go back to the spirit. And if I may add, for international conventions, and I look at the representative of UNESCO and the Council of Europe, there is, let's say, a convention on the interpretation of conventions, and there is an article on what to do when you have different linguistic versions. It says that you can never take things out of context, yet that you need to look at the spirit. And in fact, these 2 things were not always done for the Venice Charter. The next one, please. So what ICOMOS France also did was to collect examples on what was done. And there were 3 main sections. The first one, the next one, is conservation. And here you see some examples of the use of traditional techniques. Yes, the next one is the use of new techniques, which offer a lot of possibilities. However, sometimes we realize that some techniques that we thought were good actually produced terrible results. The next one, please. There were also different approaches in terms of conservation, like here, with you see there with the roof, and on the other part there is an observation platform. The next one, and now we come to restoration. One very important remark. In the French version, it's very clearly stated that conservation is the rule, restoration is the exception. It's missing in the English, but that's a considerable difference. So in the 60s, there were a couple of examples that were given. For instance, for an individual site, this was a work by Raymond Lemaire, but also an ensemble of houses that were not outstanding, like Terje mentioned already. And then, of course, Carlos Scarpa was also the important example that was given at the time. They identified examples of restitutions, of reconstructions in different contexts. I don't have the time to go further, but you have the examples. You can have different approaches. Here, for instance, in Liège, the idea was to go back to the polychromy, even if they didn't know exactly how it would have looked like. But the advantage was also that it would protect the original stone. Another example from Belgium was that although they found traces of the original polychromy, they decided to keep the 19th century conservation that was done. So they did not take away the 19th century layer. You have examples of de-restoration. The next one, please. You have restauration stigmate. I don't know how to translate that. You have works that were done to improve legibility or legibility in English of the sites. However, sometimes people misunderstand, and for instance, for the one of the churches there, they said, "Oh, we did not know that those abscisses were built in wood." Of course, they were not. But to show the difference between what it was and the new intervention, they used wood. You have evocations. Next one, please. You have contemporary creations with a, let's say, the spire in the Czech Republic, or Tallinn in Estonia. The entrance by Pei in the Louvre, and actually recently there was an artist intervention on it to show that it pops up from a rock. Unfortunately, it did not last because the glue and the sunshine did not work well together. But the same artist had also made a project where the pyramid disappeared, so that you only saw the original buildings that are behind. Next. Technical interventions like reinforcement of stability or foundations or the arches. Next one. Contrast. We mentioned that. Some examples. Here in another wall, another city wall, where the buildings that were built next to the city wall were taken away. And then in port cities, want to have, they call it often the Guggenheim or the Bilbao effect. You have Marseille, and then here Antwerp, with the building of Zaha Hadid on the historic port house. And next, use or new use. Next, still use, or in fact, what do we do with churches that are underused? It's a huge problem in my country and surrounding countries. The Netherlands have a little bit more experience, the UK as well. Sometimes you find interesting reuse. You have examples in Portugal and in Turkey. Yes, the next one. This was two more examples from France to reuse the amphitheater, and there it's a chartreuse. Work is still ongoing, and the last one is. Of that one is, oh no, that's then about the, the next one is about the enlargement of the notion of cultural heritage, because what the group looked at is the Venice Charter speaks about monuments historiques, historic monuments, and the idea was what would the Venice Charter look like if we replace that with heritage? And actually, it worked well, yeah. But the PowerPoint doesn't follow, but that doesn't matter much. I think we are almost at the end of the presentation. Ah, there, yeah, yeah. It was about the next this is about heritage. It's about the daily architecture that surrounds us, but that is not necessarily listed or protected. And it's also the gardens of the larger landscape. The next one, they looked at what does the Venice Charter, or what the spirit of the Venice Charter means for World Heritage, for towns, for landscapes, exactly what you were mentioning. the next one. Intangible heritage, and then we, let's say, we refer to the UNESCO, not the Convention of Intangible Heritage, but even the treasures of Japan that inspired the program on intangible heritage that preceded the convention. We looked at the different approaches on heritage. For instance, if the Brancusi Atelier in Paris that is in front of the Musée Pompidou, Beaubourg, is done by the museum and has a completely different approach from built heritage. It's spotless. I don't think that Brancusi would, let's say, would recognize his studio. And this, on the other hand, is the House of Darwin. Now, it was not like that either, because between Darwin and nowadays, the house was used as a boarding house. So you can imagine that he did not leave his glasses and his pens on the desk. So that was done for educational purposes. But to what extent do the people who visited understand that this was an evocation rather than what it was? It's a question, no? The next one are the crafts. And then here we come, of course, with the regional and the local dimension and the people that we need. And we should not always just think in terms of new technology, but also value the people who have, let's say, the intelligence in their hands. Yes. Emilia mentioned that, and then the conclusion is actually, it's too small, but maybe the conclusions were that the spirit of the Venice Charter as such remains still valid as some of the main questions that you raise. To find appropriate answers let's say, lead to quality projects. And the next one, there are some principles that the Venice Charter was built upon values, about thinking about common heritage for humankind, and that there is a need for respect and preservation in a spirit of solidarity and respect for cultural diversity, which remains valid. And then there are also a list of let's say, of values. The next, because there is an agreement on why we need to do it. The major difficulty is how do we do it? It's like the participatory approach. It's not questioned anymore, at least not in the heritage circles, but how do you do it? That's the main question. And in order to answer those questions, there are still, let's say, some major principles. The first one is that you need first to study the heritage that you have. And that has to come before everything else, before the money or the program or whatever. It needs to come from the heritage itself. Otherwise, program and a heritage do not match. The second is that the intervention should be respectful of the values that you have identified. The third one is that maintenance is still most important before you have major interventions, and that use should be respectful. So what ICOMOS France is going to do is to present, it's much more, let's say, this was an overview. You have a text of conclusions. ICOMOS France will propose a further debate, because let's say, when we look at our task and looking at the local or the regional specificities, sometimes the focus is on one of those aspects or another aspect, and it's a little bit different from in each of our countries. So it needs more thought and more discussion, and the whole idea is that we can learn from each other. I would like to end this presentation here, and I'm very sorry to apologies to Benjamin Mouton that I did not pay tribute to his wonderful presentation, but I thought it was important for you to have an idea of the, let's say, the work that has been done with the help of all those ICOMOS national committees. Are there any questions? Yes.
Hello, thank you very much for your presentations. I think that every convention that is ever drafted is drafted with the premise that the legal regime that adopted it will not change. And this, unfortunately, is not always the case. So in light of this, I have a question about the principle that you have described, that maintenance should come first. And I would like you to speak about how this is relevant for Eastern Europe, where a lot of what is now cultural heritage has been expropriated and has been used by the communist regime and changed. And so now it comes back to the legal owners. And how far do the owners have the duty to preserve the traces of a regime that has been imposed on them? Yes, so this is basically my question. Without being polemic, I would just like to hear any of you speak to this. Thank you.
Yes, that's a... maybe the answer was just in the last... in one of the conclusions of this presentation by Benjamin Mouton. It's... If you analyze, you're talking about heritage that has different layers. And you have, the first thing is to acknowledge that it has different layers. The second thing is you have to study the layers. And then the difficulty will be to dissociate you from one of those regimes and to make an assessment of the values. Is that easy? No. Will you make sometimes mistakes? Yes. And I just will give you one example. In Venice, in '64, when they adopted the Venice Charter, they also adopted some resolutions. One of them was to create what would become ICOMOS, or ICOMOS. There was only one resolution that was linked to a site, to heritage. You know which one it was? It was on the Maison du Peuple by Horta in Brussels. And the people present in Venice asked the Belgian authorities not to destroy the house of Horta, the Maison du Peuple of Horta. What did the Belgian authorities do? They destroyed it. And they replaced it by an office building. And so, would they ever destroy the Horta Maison du Peuple today? No. So bear that example in mind. And also when we discuss the difference, or when the discussion between experts and civil society or citizens is presented, we should be aware not to polarize. They are not opposing camps. Experts are citizens as well and are also part of the civil society. And so at that time we should have listened to the experts. So you mentioned that very nicely, to find the balance. The importance is also of taking informed decisions. Does that answer a little bit your question?
Well, yeah, hello. Okay. No, just to try to give a short answer. First of all, again, there are two sides to the question. And these two sides are decided by whether you have only exterior protection of the building, or if you also are protecting the interiors. When you do the latter, you are giving yourself big problems for any changes interiorly, etc. So to be a bit blunt, we say that if we protect the interior of a house, we are creating a museum. So we are very reluctant to protect interiors. That's the first thing. The second thing I wanted to say is that when the authorities have decided to protect a building, they must have a case file which states what reasons and what values, etc., are important in this building. And that should be available to you as a citizen, and it should definitely be available to you as an owner. There are some countries in the former Eastern Europe where this documentation is secret. And the cultural heritage inspectors come to the owners and they say, you cannot change this, you cannot change that. And the person says, well, show me the protection order, etc., so we can discuss it. And the inspector says, no, that's not available. This is not a good policy. This undermines the transparency and the trust, etc.
Yes. Baiba? The light should be off.
Thank you, thank you. I'm Baiba Murnica from Riga, from Latvia, from the country which had this temptation to use a lot of money for making a lot of things in historical places. And in the turn of the systems, in the beginning of 90s, we had the notion Europe-like renovation, which Europeans do not understand, but the people in our countries wanted to create the places which looked like Europe, and this was the worst, these were the worst examples. And what I wanted to say is that we have this temptation with a lot of amount of money to do a lot of things in places which we have not investigated. So this is what was told, that before the money, the investigation should come. And then also there are a lot of cases when we do not need a lot of money. And this is the case of so-called Norwegian money, because in the Norwegian programs we do not have millions. We have 500,000 for one object, which is enough for heritage object. And when we speak about good practice, then we always mention the Norwegian projects, the projects where we had to think about how to use the money in proper way and not to use too much money. And the other thing is we had to use the knowledge of the Norwegian colleagues. So this is also a very important thing in such projects. One thing is not to have too much money, too much investments in one object, and the other thing is to use the knowledge which already have the other experts. And so when I have the microphone, I am a strongest supporter of Therius regarding the capacity of heritage institutions. And I think this should be mentioned in our conclusions, that the capacity of heritage institutions should be developed. The Norwegian projects usually are, for the heritage projects are 5 or 6 objects per period. In the last period of EU money, there was 27 objects funded by EU. And in this project, in this period, there will be 56 projects funded by EU. It's not possible for heritage institutions to to keep the quality, to maintain the quality, to even evaluate the documents, as you, Stefan told. So the capacity of the heritage institutions and also of involved personnel, of the persons who are working with heritage should be strengthened. So, thank you.
Thank you. Stefan had asked for the floor, and afterwards, Matteo. Yeah. Can I also ask, meanwhile, to put, and then there as well, so 3, and 4, it's good. So can I, meanwhile, ask to have the last slide? You remember that Armenia had presented the quality principles that of the selection criteria that the working group developed, and for each of them you have a series of questions, but just keep that in mind, because some of the questions are directly related to a number of things that you have mentioned. And if not, think about possible recommendations so that we can conclude our session with that. Stefan, you asked for the floor.
Yeah. Okay. First, I would like to add something to try to respond to your question that you asked earlier, because I think it was somehow not answered entirely. And I think it's an ethical component to the answer that we need to start with. Because in this case, we are talking about owners that have recovered their property after years of being dispossessed by the state. And now the state imposes on them the duty to maintain the property. This is the case where we start from. And then the answer, of course, is that as long as we talk of a common good, when we talk of heritage, then we should also talk of a shared responsibility between the state and the owner. And this is not currently the case in Romania, and I don't know about other countries, so I wouldn't say anything about other countries. Here, it still is not the case, and we should get to the point as fast as possible where the state takes the responsibility of contributing to the maintenance of cultural heritage, as long as also the state is the one who imposes the restrictions that come along with the status of cultural heritage property. So this is, to me, is very clear, and I represent an institution of the state, and I can only say that this is not happening yet here. So it should be a principle that we should talk of shared responsibility, and that needs to be transferred into practical terms, not just into statements. Because we have it in the Cultural Heritage Code that is being developed. Now we are actually in the process of a major redesign of our legal system for the protection of cultural heritage. And this is one of the principles of the new Heritage Code. But it's a principle. We have to also turn it into practical tools. And I totally agree, and we don't have an answer yet for that.
Can we add that in the recommendations from this meeting? There was another EU flagship program also on, let's say, on privately owned houses. Yes, and I look very much forward to their conclusions, which is also seeking a balance between responsibilities and duties. Yes.
And I would like to return a little bit to our discussion on, let's say, developments in theory. And as long as we start from the concept of heritage community that the Faro Convention proposes, I would like to ask you, how do you think that heritage communities can be developed, or how do they occur? Because from the practical examples that we heard of today, either is Fontecchio in Italy or Viscri in Romania, those are situations where communities have developed themselves some tools and means to deal with cultural heritage. But we are just taking note that this has happened. we as professionals. And my question is, how do we develop this relationship between professionals and communities as a working relationships? My impression is that for now we are just observing, and at the same time as professionals we protect our territory. We tend to talk about communities, but still we always bring to discussion the restrictions that we need to impose on them. I don't have an answer. I'm asking, how do you see this relationship? Because otherwise it will remain just a word, heritage community, and we are going to proceed as before, business as usual, doing our professional stuff and creating inventories, imposing restrictions, enforcing them as much as we can or we cannot. It's proven that we cannot. And still we are not going to use this fantastic, I think, new way of putting the whole cultural heritage system, starting from the community as an agent, active agent. So this is one question, how do we do with this? And then another question that also has to do with theory, with an example that we didn't have here. It wasn't presented, but we live with it in this part of Europe. When we talk of religious heritage, differently from the western part of Europe where you have redundant churches and you have a problem of how to reuse them, we have a very intensive use of churches here, and this brings along sometimes conflicts between the way professionals see those churches and the way the community, the religious community sees the church. Because we as professionals tend to look at them as cultural heritage, and thus use the principles and the theoretical tools that we have to deal with cultural heritage. And that means, for instance, when we talk of murals, of frescoes, to preserve what you have, to apply conservation, not to reconstruct missing figures. But that means for the believers that you are not talking of an icon anymore, or at least for some of them, the liturgical function of the icon has to suffer. And this is a conflict that has to do with this new approach about cultural heritage. If we agree that the community is the agent, then if the community perceives heritage differently from us, what do we do? I don't have an answer to this one either. I can't get out of my skin as a professional, and I keep on looking at those objects as cultural heritage first, even if I'm a believer as well, but I don't have this problem. But the problem exists, and it's quite serious in many cases. And this should be also solved with the help of theory. We have to reposition ourselves or not, but address the issue starting from the theory and then going to the practical answers. So these two main things I would like to ask you to discuss as much as we can.
And you bring us back to the basic things. To what extent does theory inform our practice? And I'm not so sure, to be honest, because often we see that the research in social sciences or in conservation science is either, let's say, very linked to let's say, to theoretical principles about, for instance, identity, or to material things, very specific things. But what we need on the site, there are many questions. But the first question was about heritage community. I give that to Francesc.
Well, first of all, it's like what we discussed about quality. There's so many definitions and non-precise. Well, our colleague from UNESCO has already confirmed that they avoided in the Intangible Convention to define. If you read it correctly, they say within that we consider that, that, and that. The FARA Convention tries to give a concept on community, heritage communities, but maybe it's too general, and sometimes it's the problem because it encompasses everything. You're saying we have a group of persons who has a similar approach. Okay, what is in terms? And many times we have sometimes it's one of the issues we have when we are trying to promote a Faro Convention, because people say, what on earth are you talking about? And that is one thing we are addressing, because now we are trying to do in the presentation some more detailed aspects on that. But I think it's very much related to this concept of having a common perception of the object. And you have, but you have different, that's a point. So because we, especially as I say, when you have different groups, ethnic groups, you talk about that or that, they can have a different view of the same object. And then you have to deal with that. And I think that it happens a lot when you're talking about this religious building. I have 3 examples on exactly the same problem, and I think 3 solutions who are very different. I was recently in Maastricht. In Maastricht, they have a church who was not used, and they decided to convert it in something. And they thought about, and they decided to convert it in a bookshop. Okay? But the structure was made in a way that if tomorrow they decide to, that there is a lot of new believers and they have to, everything can be taken away completely. The next week I was in Ireland, in Dublin, and I was, yes, exactly, and I was exactly in the same situation. There was a church who was not used. But this time it was converted in a bar and a restaurant. So you still have the remainings, the paintings, the whole thing, but the bar is there. Honestly, the reversibility, I have some doubts. And you can have even more extreme situation, because I remember there's a case, I think it's in north Spain, of a church who was not used. And here, it was more surprising for me. In Ireland already, but maybe in Ireland, no, because you have 2 religions, the Pops and the Catholic religion. So in some sense, it was a good mixture. So maybe that makes not some problems of consciences, because they trust as much on Pops and religion. But in Spain, for example, I was very surprised that they managed to organize, and in Netherlands, they have also an example. They are Protestants, maybe they are more flexible. They organize a skating ring inside the church. And furthermore, as it was not, let's say, of a very artistic interest, the interior, they asked graphic artists to rework the whole thing. You can find it on YouTube. You search, I don't remember exactly whose city it's, but it was very interesting, because then you bring a completely different way, and it brings what we say the needs. Because this was successful because there was a group of persons who say, okay, we will maintain it because it will have a different use and we will maintain it. And furthermore, they add what probably in the future will be some heritage, because now, of course, we are saying that the paintings of Da Vinci are artistic things, historical things, but maybe in 1 century, all this graphic artist painting will be considered that. It's already the case if you are considering there's still now expositions and things like that, valuing this kind of art. So I think that there is different responses, and it goes very much in the direction of what we are saying. What is the value for the people? And the value is very changing. And from this point of view, in some sense, having a general view on how we have to do the things, who was maybe a little bit the historical theories of conservation was, okay, one was, we change everything to make it modern. The other says, no, we don't touch anything because we destroy it. I think the things are moving far quicker, and we are changing to something who has a meaning to the people. And that is the importance, but it's also the challenge, because we are not fitting to the usual way of thinking.
I will challenge or add an extra question. The meaning for the people today, or for the people in 15 years or 30 years? Well, if you think, because I add another example to your list of churches. In London, there is a former church that was converted in a swimming pool, with all the decorated paintings conserved. Now, architects know how difficult it is to build a swimming pool where, yes, I see people laughing, and then you do that in a building like this. It's so, and then how will and Erminia also mentioned this this morning. Will those projects be successful? And then you need again to link with the communities, and then we come back to your initial question: what is a community? Yeah.
Well, it's a very smart term, heritage communities, because it basically means everything. Yeah. So heritage communities are flexible. They metamorphose. They are born. They die. There are public associations. We have 230,000 people, members of historic and cultural heritage associations in Norway. Okay? But it can be a congregation in a church. Okay, and if there is a congregation and the church is being run and it's being used, then the congregation has to pay if the church cannot pay for itself. So I don't see the big problem. I see a big problem explaining to some people what heritage communities are, because it's so flexible. I mean, the three of us, we can be a heritage community. We can go out to some fortified church and sit down and picket and say, we want to save this church, we want to collect money. That's fair enough. That's within our rights as citizens. And that is what is really meant. It's people engaging in heritage, taking responsibilities or just showing interests or mixing in the affairs of the municipality and all those things which some Eastern European countries don't like so much. Because I mentioned that we had a special envelope in the Norwegian funding mechanism for NGOs. And I can be very open about this is creating big problems for the financial mechanism in Poland and in Hungary for the moment, because they want to decide who gets the money. And we want an open procedure. So then you can ask yourself, no, okay, this is official policy. Doesn't it contradict the whole idea of heritage communities?
Exactly. Before. The
working method between professionals, okay, public administration and heritage communities. If we accept that there is a rearrangement of actors in the cultural heritage system, it's not top-down anymore, it's not expert-led anymore, but it's bottom-up and it's community-led. And how do we rearrange these things, or do we participate into the...
Don't make it too complicated. Don't think too much in the beginning, you know? Just start talking to them. Just start involving them. Start having a dialogue with them. Find out where you disagree. You know, it's just a process. And you have to initiate it. And that's it. Don't think so much more about it. See what comes out.
We are talking with quality, and that's why I'm asking myself how do you...
Yeah. Draw your attention to the work that ICOMOS has been doing on the rights-based approaches and World Heritage, because ultimately that led to work by the European committees on participation in the Faro Convention. And at the occasion of the 70th anniversary of the Declaration of Human Rights, ICOMOS adopted a declaration on actually saying exactly that. Start by discussion and consulting. And the idea is, in fact, to provide some guidance on how to do it. It's not about questioning, but it's on how. And it can be very simple. Don't ask questions. I give the floor here because I see that Mr. UNESCO has received a call.
No, I think that the comment of Terje was very good in the sense that maybe the thing is not to arrive with a solution already. And the idea is to say to the people, how do you feel? How do you will use it? What do you think? Maybe they will have crazy things, you know? But then precisely it's your technician point of view of saying, well, that is very nice, but it will harm that. And then I think people are not so stupid, you know, that they understand and they trust you. But at one point, sometimes it's very interesting to do that. Because, for example, I remember visiting in Madrid. We organized a meeting on Faro, and we always try to organize some visits in order to make visible what it means. And I remember that we visited a neighborhood who is not well known, but it's quite in the center, but it's not well known, because even Madridian people never visited. It was amazing. And there was a former caserne who was not used by the militaries, and the community of Madrid decided to organize a very fashionable art exposition place and so on. But the problem is that there was, in some sense, bankrupt or something like that, the municipality, and then half the work was done. And in fact, it was the association of the neighborhood who say, well, we can use it, not for a fashionable art thing, but to organize our events and organize festivals and things like that. So in fact, it was a way that the people bring you the solution to preserve this historical building, because they give a content to it. So that, I think, it's in this sense that we have to involve them. And in all the cases we are saying it's the case. Maybe if we consider just from the aesthetical point of view, in the case of Visky, for example, we can say, oh, we transform it in some kind of eco-museum. Well, it has its limits, because we see that there is everywhere and something. Here, we discuss with the people and we realize that the problem is, if we want to still have people there and to maintain it, you have to stick the person there. And the way is to give them some ways to live. And so, this mixture of having some, let's say, more business-oriented thing, but with respect of the principles of restoration and so on, arrives to a good point. And it fit, furthermore, to a fashionable thing, who is now the situation, because nowadays, we are always, when we are going on holidays, trying to find a nice place who is authentic. So, all these things mix quite well. But sometimes I think it's what I insisted at the beginning, the conclusions of my intervention, when there was this question on when the people has to participate. I said the problem is that sometimes it's too late. We arrive with all the solutions, and then it has to redistract all the project and so on, so it's problematic. But if we do it very early, first we already see all the problems that can emerge and that can appear. And that is what I'm saying every time we are going to see a mayor who's a little bit reticent on a project with the communities. I say, listen, if there is a problem, it will emerge anyway. So maybe it's better to discuss it first, maybe try to solve it by a compromise, and then do the things. And I think it's the way to go, and it's in the way that we have to use precisely these communities to see, because at the end of the day, all the presentation of Professor Mouton was on value. And the question is what is the value?
Can I first give the floor to Matteo, who had asked the floor. Patrick, I know that you want, but later. No. It's important for conservation, but we have time, so I take the order of the speakers. Matteo, please.
Well, now the discussion is going into a different direction, but I wanted to anticipate a couple of points in my presentation for tomorrow, because they are about capacity building and capacities in general. And they are taken from the report on the second cycle of the periodic reporting for World Heritage. It's a document dated 2016. The next one is still not out. But, okay, 2 points. 48 state parties. It's a self-assessment exercise. The respondents are the World Heritage national focal points and site managing authorities. the majority of respondents expressed different grades of concern about their capacity and resources to enforce legislation. And, more worryingly, only 7 states out of 48 reported to have national strategies in place for training and education, suggesting that capacity development is given very low priority in most European states. That was it, very shortly.
Well, that was very good to recall that because it's directly linked to what Baiba raised. No, sorry. there was somebody else, the person with, yeah.
I come from the European Council of Architects, and we are not specialized all into dealing with heritage, and this you can observe all over the place, unfortunately. And we all know how much need for quality there is in doing projects. We can also state that dealing with heritage in ways that are adapted to our age is also a matter of general taste. And into discussion, you don't need only architects or conservationists or specialists, but also anthropologists to deal with issues of society. They're mostly missing into this. And they analyze cases of the past, good and bad practice, or bad and good practice in this order. What I would like you to comment, perhaps, is the necessity, if there is any, to be able to articulate a little bit more simple for the general society, for the clients maybe, state, public or private clients, a type of standard. You are speaking about standards, but they are standards of approach, not a standard of technical intervention. How to deal with heritage today. If you look at a ruined fortress or a church which is underused, or an urban commercial house from the 19th century, is there necessity today to guide a little bit the general taste into knowing that it's not good to wipe out the building and keep the facade and build in the back a 5 stories building with a concrete structure, like we see today in Romania very often? And because nowadays we face a mockery into being served with keeping the memory of the past from the client side a little bit, and also from the architect side, which means keeping a corner of the building and getting rid of everything else. And I think, in my view, there is a necessity to articulate a little bit more what is right and what is wrong. Even if, from a professional point of view, this is very difficult and perhaps even wrong. Yeah? Who gets the mic?
Exactly. I will give your question to answer to Professor Kovacs. Sorry, there was still, I had, but I first give the floor to Professor Kovacs to answer your question, and after that you will be, Patrick. Is anybody else for questions afterwards, so that you know a little bit in which order? Nobody for the time being? Yeah, okay. Can we just have the last slide with the different principles, because the little sentences are maybe, let's say, hooks that you can use?
Thank you. Actually, you, Benedict, said earlier a very good phrase, I think, which goes well with what's been asked, that is trickle down theory. Not down to earth and down to the public, down to partners, because it's very nice that you're talking to each other and very much agree on most things which are brought into discussion. But in the end, if we don't manage to disseminate what we think is right, then we hardly have a chance to have our job done properly, no matter how good expertise we can provide and how many good pieces of legislation we have in place and how much money we can gather to such and such intervention. Probably teaching remains altogether the basic need for all these things. It's not there. Dissemination. I think much of the useful theories are already in place. Much of the methodology is already practiced, experimented, and judged properly. The institutions are well and functioning. What we still need, indeed, obviously, is to get out with all this to the public. And, well, trickle down is very, very nice, and I don't mind the vertical direction, because we are supposed to know better. And that's not a matter of being proud or arrogant or to dictate conditions. It's a responsibility to give further, and then there is responsibility to those, not just future generations, but for the present generations too. I mean, they should know better too. And then we have partners, not opponents, in owners of historical monuments, in priests, and so on and so forth. I think I can't say anything better than that.
Actually, to make a difference, in the document that was prepared by ICOMOS, you have one of the first recommendations is that heritage professionals should be aware and implement the international standards that exist. The second recommendation is a recommendation to UNESCO, to the Council of Europe, and to the others, is to make their standard-setting text widely available. Now, the Council of Europe recently has updated its website, and it's much better than before. Congratulations. So this is already, if I'm optimistic, I will say this is already a result of this exercise. I don't think so. Honestly, it must have been, let's say, a parallel exercise, but we are very proud that that's done. About the teaching, there's also a recommendation that even in teachings on architecture, one should speak about heritage, because in the end there is a continuity. It doesn't stop. Where do you stop heritage from contemporary there? And there is always a dialogue. So it's obvious. So that's there as well. Those things were rather to let's say to select projects that are, let's say, that should be of good quality, but under those principles and under those wordings come a series of questions that hopefully you can use when you discuss with the people who give you a project. The main problem, however, is that often they have already an idea in their head, and then it's often too late. In fact, it's the opposite way around. They have selected the building or the fortress, and no, they have a program, and then they imply it on that fortress, whether it works or it doesn't work. That's one of the problems. Patrick, it's your. No, sorry. But you know, but then you and you. Anybody else afterwards? You? Okay.
Oh, okay. Yeah, okay. Two small points. The first one is about. We spoke about the integrative approach, and I think very important is preventive conservation. And preventive conservation, this is one knowledge-based conduct research and service first of all, and also assessment of the layers and also awareness raising. I think this preventive conservation is really important and is a constituent for the integrative approach. And the second is about what Terry said. He spoke about he is hesitant to protecting the interior. But I think if the value is, if the interior is the really value of residences perhaps, or mansion houses or so you have to look at it and you have to protect it. So I wouldn't be, I know it's not easy, of course. It's really, it makes conflicts, but you should do at least.
There's a very nice example in the Netherlands about protecting of interiors that were threatened by kitchens. I don't know if you know more about it. I heard it in a meeting. It was that owners wanted to have a new kitchen, and of course, they have the right to have a new kitchen. But then by talking to the owners and looking at the interior decorations, they decided instead of having, if I'm not wrong, instead of having all the kitchen cabinets on the walls where there were the decorations, started to work with the central island, and so that they could maintain. And it was just by thinking together, how do we keep the essential fittings. So it is possible. Do you know something more about it?
I don't know. I don't know this. You know more about this than I do, I guess. But I think it's an illustration of what the former speaker just said. The relevance of interiors, and in the Netherlands, when a building is by the state listed monument, that goes for the whole of the building. So it is the exterior and the interior, because the interior can say a lot about the history, the use of the building. So it's important, and it's true, it doesn't make it easy, but it doesn't say that nothing is possible, of course, but you have to take everything into account and do research also into the internal structure, and because it's the integral building. But I don't know this example, but I will ask.
At last.
I'm not sure whether we start now again with the heritage communities, but maybe we can do that tomorrow in the session 2B, which will be about communities and social innovation, because maybe it opens up a new, maybe a longer discussion now, what I would like. I have maybe an idea how you could define, or at least get some structure into this, and let's discuss that tomorrow.
Patrick, but since you had the mic, I wanted you to introduce something about conservation theories and interpretation, because we have not mentioned interpretation yet.
So then, interpretation is a lot about why heritage is meaningful, and how it can become meaningful for different people. And now I come to the heritage community, because in my understanding, as I naively understood it from the Faro Convention, a heritage community comprises all those people for whom a specific piece of heritage is meaningful. And this can be local people, it can be people who live in another continent, at another continent, if it's a famous World Heritage site, for example. I would differentiate the heritage community for whom it is meaningful, and they just care because of that about it, from stakeholders who might be neighbors who are affected by the traffic or by the visitation, who are the owners who are affected in a different way, or those who have a stake because of legal responsibilities or whatever. So these would be two different groups. And the third one, when I think as a heritage interpreter, is the wider public, the visitors for whom the place is not really very much meaningful, but who are curious to learn something and to be inspired by the place, which is also the task of heritage interpreters to deal with. But if you define the heritage community like that it comprises all those for whom this structure or this tradition is meaningful, then it can be meaningful for very different reasons for different persons. And one practical approach could be to, if this might reshape the theory of, or add to the theory of conservation, could be when you discuss about listing a building, a structure or whatever, and you create a file why it is protected, that you do not only list under the values of this place the perception or the judgment of the expert architect or art historian or archaeologist or whatever, but that you investigate and already involve those for whom this place is meaningful in the local community and others, so that this would become part of this file that describes why this place is protected. And this can also be helpful when you have a multi-layered heritage to get some ideas which layers are important for which different groups. And how to approach these people would be one in these most early stages, and then later when you start to think about projects, also let's say tourism development projects or whatever, to involve these people from the heritage community to how it could be interpreted from their perspectives also, so not only from the experts' perspective, but also these different other perspectives. And then you get them into the discussion, and then you get them in contact also with the conservation experts and the scholars who are responsible for this place. But that's one way that they can really do something as co-creators of a heritage interpretation, how you can get them and how you can interest them in a rather early stage. So that's the point.
Patrick, and is this based on research and conservation theories that have been recently developed? Because you speak about the practicalities on the ground, but what's the theoretical framework for this?
This theoretical framework is under development. We rethink right now the theory of heritage interpretation. There was an understanding coming from the national parks in North America, but also a lot in Great Britain, that the heritage interpreters are those who tell the people why it is worth to protect the place. So this was a one-directional thing. There was very often one core message to get across to the people, and this changes very much to not giving people one single message, but to confront them with different meanings, different perspectives that will make them rather arouse deeper questions and a longer interest than giving the simple answers. And this is based on theories going back to Hannah Arendt, and I and others in our association started to think about that when we were thinking about heritage in Krakow, which goes back to totalitarianism, and the question arose for us: what could we have done to, if we have lived in the 1920s? What would have been our responsibility as heritage interpreters to avoid something like that, and what kind of, because heritage interpretation can influence how people shape their identities, how they close them or how they open them, for example, how dynamic they understand them or how fixed they understand them. And there's a lot of potential in heritage interpretation in this regard, and this brought us to these considerations about multiple meanings and also controversial meanings or paradox meanings. I will present that tomorrow briefly in my statement.
Thank you. So that was quite interesting with the question that was addressed to us. Andrea, I first give the floor, or do you have something specific to this? No, afterwards, yeah.
These interpreters come back to 150 years ago with John Ruskin and Viollet-le-Duc to interpret in two different ways. But I wanted to comment about the definitions of quality that you mentioned. Among them, this relation to needs, and this is essential, I believe, because we tend to forget to define the needs, or we think that the way we define the needs are the community needs and so on. And coming to the quality, it seems that Venice Charter, it's mostly principles about how to do things in a good way, but not explaining why are we doing this. So for this reason, I think today people are in Capidava, it happened what it happened because people are seeing heritage protection, let's say so-called heritage protection, as just a tool for developing tourism. So in fact, it's what I needed when I insisted in, when developing the sketch, the draft for Heritage Code, to start from a set of principles. And one of them I insisted to be this one. Protection of heritage, the purpose of heritage protection is to pass on to the next generation something that is authentic and unspoiled, because it's something, a physical witness of history. And since when you can define the purpose of heritage protection, then we can apply quality according to that purpose. But then today multiple purposes are in place, and most of them are economic. So we cannot turn the blind eye and ask somebody to protect his house when the value of the land below the house is much greater than the house itself. Then of course you will get a lot of economic pressure, like in Maison du Peuple. Probably it will be the same today. Probably they will not destroy it, but they will move it somewhere else, because the plot, the land will be so. So this is why I wanted to intervene, not to forget to better define the purpose of heritage conservation before dealing with the means. And yeah.
I probably skipped it in the presentation that I gave on behalf of Benjamin Mouton, because that was one of the conclusions on the differences between the French and the English version. That is that the English version is very pragmatic, but in the French version you have a specific reference to the why. And in the English version that's kept. It's more, let's say, maybe if you know it, you can look and you can interpret it, but you need to know it and to look for it, whereas in the French version, it's very, very specific. Do you want to add something on that before I give the...
It's... The memory, well, we share it all of us, and the why you are asking to be somehow formulated and expressed and explained and interpreted only needs a name, and this is it has to do with our need to remember, and we all share this. And I think as soon as you manage to make this understandable to the wider public, you get what you want, cooperation from them. And then perhaps the economic pressure will no longer be so important and so strong. We might never become Norwegians, but we might improve in some way or another, I suppose.
I'm not so sure about this economic pressure, to be honest. I still think that it's either the ego of putting your stamp on something, and we saw some projects on that. Either it's the economic dimension, and I'm not so sure that the why and to pass on to the future generations is strong enough. During the Davos meeting on the high-quality baukultur, the Swiss organizers invited a Canadian researcher who was doing research on heritage and architecture and well-being on our health. So, when I was a student, we called that architectural determinism. But apparently, this is an area that is open for research. If we would know that a bad environment and a bad project is bad for our, let's say, for our health, maybe we would be a little bit stronger. Yeah.
One short answer. Because I was relating to our national legislation, because in northern countries, in Norway or in Sweden, common sense works. So a law is very thin. So you operate with very short notions, and everybody is agreeing. But in Romania, the proof that I'm right in what I'm saying is that because we have no definition of purpose in our legislation for historic monuments, for instance, when we are bringing causes to the court, judges rule against the public institution, I believe, because they don't see what damage have been done. So what is the reason to punish some people because he demolished some minor cottage that was protected by somebody else? So this is what I wanted to stress in a way.
Very important. Thank you, Andrea, and after Terje, and then also we need to be at the clock tower at 6 sharp, and it's 5 minutes, 10 minutes walk, 10 minutes. So we have 10 more minutes for the debate. The light should be off.
Oh, should be off. Okay. I didn't know. Only my intuition said to me that I will agree with my colleague, because also I wanted to talk a little pragmatic about economic facts, but not about community, but about the owner. And I will have just a short question with something like yes or no for 3 of you, not for Professor Kovac, about the very beginning of the new monument, when you decide to protect something or you decide not to protect. I wanted to ask if are there any studies, financial studies, because we saw that money can destroy monuments, money can hire professionals. I don't know about those 2 churches, I don't know about the bookstore, but I visited the pub and it was full. You have to make a reservation there to that church specifically. So the question is, are there any economical studies that will show us and give us a mechanism, give us an instrument to fight with this and show the people if, when we decide to protect a monument, to list it, is the value increase, or it's going up, or it's going down? It's going, well, in Romania, well, so we cannot pretend we are speaking equally, even in community and society, because in Romania it goes down. Because of all those, no, don't do this, don't do that, because all the lack in the institution, because the lack of the public-private partnership, because all of this. So I was just curious if exist, because this is one of that moment when the owner, even only from financial point of view, decides himself that it is a richer people. Not speaking about any cultural, just pragmatically about money, and not to destroy them.
I ask Terje to answer that, because in the whole Nordic countries they have a different answer than in other countries. I can already tell you that in my country the heritage regulations has been made more flexible, so that the protection is less, precisely because the owners thought that the heritage administrations were too, let's say, not flexible enough for their demands. But whether that has an economic impact, we do not know. We know that it's terrible for the heritage.
Okay, I had a couple of comments to what has been said, but I can start with this, the question of pricing. I think it must also be seen in a context. 90% of the houses in Norway are owned by the people who live in them. That makes a great change, because there is hardly any rental market. It's small, 10%. Yeah. And every house owner, whether you own an individual house or you own a flat in a larger house, has an obligation to maintain their house. That's for everybody. It would be an uproar if you drove through some of these villages in here with a Norwegian bus, with municipal building people. They would go bananas, you know? They would immediately issue orders for the roofs to be changed and things to be done. Okay, but it's years of bad management. We find that the value of a property, if it is protected, goes up by between 5 to 15%. And the same goes for the buildings that are not protected but are listed as historically interesting. So what does this mean for you as an owner? It means, well, first of all, you have to pay more to get it. Okay, don't forget that. But it means that your investment is more secure, because it has been proven, not in Norway, but there are some studies done in Denmark and other places, Sweden, where it shows that when the housing market drops, the protected environments, etc., are more resilient. They withstand the drop in prices better. So from that point of view, it's a better investment. And you will, if it is protected, you will get some money, but you have to apply for it. Okay? So our general policy is that we know that an antiquarian procedure, as we call it nicely, costs about 30 to 40% more than a normal maintenance stuff. So that's where we put our money. We give it, we follow the list of conditions that I showed, and then we give out the money, and it's 40 to 50% self-financed by the owner. So we don't have this problem. But I understand why it is a problem some places. So the legislation has to be flexible enough. As I said, if you can't give them a modern kitchen and a bathroom, you've lost. Then the house will fall down sooner or later, if people behave rationally. Now, I had a couple of other comments, you know. One to this as a cultural, no, okay, I'll be very short. The built cultural heritage is not only culture, it's also environment. I come from the Ministry of Environment. It's a resource for the circular economy. It's an environmental resource, saving us resources to build new. We must take this into regards too. Therefore, the interiors, protecting interiors, be cautious. I would just repeat it, because who the hell is going to pay? Nobody wants to live in a protected interior. It becomes, per se, more or less a museum. So don't behave like that, or be very reticent if you do it. And then finally, this procedural way of working, of talking to the heritage communities, etc., is time-consuming. Yeah, and when we are short of personnel already, and we have to handle a lot of other new things, this procedural way is, we don't have resources for it. Thank you.
Thank you. I give, yeah. And then, I'm sorry, but I am afraid that we will have to close the session.
The opposite, okay. It's the opposite. It seems not logical, but it doesn't matter. Well, by training, I'm an economist, so I will say you that it depends a lot also of the perception of the people. And it depends on what they consider fashionable. If the fashionable thing is the old one, of course, this phenomenon of 10% or 50%, it's clear. But if the society, in some sense, consider that only the latest fashionable thing, concrete and so on, is the thing to go, then you don't have this phenomenon. And I think that I visit many times for previous work to Moscow, and I think it was a very good example of this change of mind. Moscow, I know it 10 years ago, the fashionable thing was to bring down the old buildings and do big buildings concrete. Nowadays, you have seen that they are moving to restoring historical neighborhoods. They are making pedestrian zones, things that were unbelievable in the way of thinking 10 years ago. And I always say, well, maybe it's the fact that the people are more visiting, going to other countries like Paris, London and so on, and seeing that, well, it's very nice to have an old building, and if you can adjust it with the new comfort and so on, as you say, Terge. But it's very much more interesting and more attractive to live there than to have a very anonymous flat in a 10-story building. So I think that the problem is that it depends a lot of the perception of the people. And I think that in Romania, I have been last time already, and we'll have the discussion about how it will do. I think it's still a little bit too fashionable to have a new building done. Instead of saying, okay, we take that and we adjust it and we keep the old building, but with the new facilities. So, but I think that it will come, because the interest of the buyers will be different, and the same for the companies. Nowadays, an hotel, you know, if you make an anonymous hotel, it's not very attractive. If I go to Booking, I see a very nice facade and some historical things inside. I say, well, it's pleasant, and we'll go there. Yeah. So I think things are changing, and the mind are changing, and of course the vision is the same. Give you another example. I discovered that now in Paris, it's very fashionable to retake what were the old HLM bars. Because people has realized one thing, that these flats who were from the 60s and so on, I'm talking inside Paris, no? They are far more comfortable because they have more space than the other things, the other flats that are in the market nowadays. So it's turning out. Before it was considered as not interesting, but in fact it proves that maybe at the beginning the architects were not so silly. They make it very rational, and it's what we see with Le Corbusier. At the end of the day, it was very rational what he proposed, but at the moment it seems crazy. And what? Yes, and it was also in terms of the value. I think also that we have not to forget, and there was the comment on this, what we can call uncomfortable heritage that we have to handle. And sometimes this uncomfortable, it's to the use that was made, but the outside, or it's very interesting. And we have the example, for example, of project, a route who exists in the Council of Europe, who's Atrium, who considers different places where they have this uncomfortable heritage. And within that, we have Forli in Italy, who's very close to the principles of Faro. They are not active members, but they are following the same idea. And the idea is to try to see what are the needs and the changes that they can introduce in former fascist buildings, who on themselves, in the architectural story, represents a significant improvement. But of course, the content that was associated to that has a problem. So here also we have to work on that. And the evaluations of the needs is very interesting, but they're converted in schools and other things who are very useful. And people, at the end, discontextualize this building and consider it as something who is related to the new use.
Thank you. Well, we are coming at the end of our session. It would be, let's say, too difficult to make a summary of all the recommendations. However, I have the strong impression that that we realize that there are new concepts, there is research, but it's not always related to the problems that we encounter in our countries, and that may be different. So, because sometimes it's very theoretical, and there's not always a link between the research that is done and between the problems that are encountered by the heritage departments or those who are really working on the site. So maybe one of the recommendations could be to have more, let's say, research in the area of applied science, so that it's useful for the people who work. A second thing is that I realized that there are so many different situations, and we can learn from each other, like we saw this afternoon. So maybe another recommendation could be that there is more comparative research and comparative, let's say, analysis of issues. And that is already done to a certain extent at the Council of Europe, through the Strategy 21 that you presented, through FARO, through the Landscape Convention, through HERIN. But actually, there's clearly a need to do more. It's done also through the legal forum, to the European heritage heads to a certain... No, and you haven't talked about that. I think that Armenia mentioned this morning that there will be, as part of the new framework action plan, let's say a new group, or the continuation, and in fact of the stakeholder group, maybe as the representatives of the heritage administrations who will be involved need to have an eye on that, so that one of the things that will be done is to make the link between the issues that you experience and the research that you need to do, taking into account the local questions and the regional specificities. And now, yeah, it's late in the afternoon. One last thing, is there a recommendation that you feel needs absolutely to be included in the report that Andrea Pop will make? Then I will hear that now. Terje first, and then maybe
yes,
no or never.
Be silent forever. Okay, isn't that how it goes? No, in addition to the standards, I look at this list and I miss one 3-letter word very badly, and that's use.
It's in it.
Where?
No. It's in compatibility. I think so, or proportionality. The questions, no, in fact, no, no, there is a question about use, but these actually, to be honest, we took those principles, those 7 principles that are generally accepted. Use as such is, of course, it needs to be used, but how do you qualify use? And it can go in sustainability, it can go into compatibility, it can go in proportionality. So the questions that you will find under those are linked to those things. If we had put use without an adjective, it wouldn't have worked.
I wouldn't put use without an adjective. I just wanted to be very short.
It's not something about spirit of the place with a pub in the church. So it's nothing about spirit of the place with a pub in the church. So
keep the spirit.
keep the spirit of the place.
Well, then you have to ask, is it the right use? That was the initiative. There was one last comment, and then we really have to go.
Mind your responsibility towards present and future generations. This is the public benefit. You have to be accountable to present generations as well, not only to the future generations. It's very difficult to build ownership, to build accountability, to account the benefit that has to derive to present generations. Transmission is fundamental, but
you know why we did not mention the present generations? Because in the review that we did, we saw that most of the people who ask for a project only are focusing on the present needs. So this is to make people think, and therefore we focused on the future. It's not that we have forgotten it, but we have an answer. If there are more questions, we can do that while we walk. Thank you so much for this debate. It was very interesting, and I wish a lot of good luck to our rapporteur, and many thanks to our interpreters and the technicians for helping us this afternoon.
Just a technical announcement.